Carl Jung explained, sex controls. You more than you think. There is a fire that burns before we learn its name. It flickers in the spaces between thoughts, in the pause before sleep claims us, in the quickening of pulse when eyes meet across a crowded room. This is not the fire we tend with conscious hands, not the flame we kindle with intention or extinguish with will. This is the ancient fire, the primordial spark that existed before your ego learned to speak its careful words, before your persona learned to wear its careful masks. In the beginning, there was only the unconscious, that vast swirling darkness from which all consciousness eventually emerges, like a single candle flame piercing the cosmic night. And in that darkness, Eros was already stirring, already weaving the invisible threads that would one day pull you toward another, that would make your body sing songs you never taught it, that would cause your heart to recognize what your mind could never fully comprehend. You were born carrying this fire, though you did not know it. It lived in your cells, in the spiral of your DNA, in the ancient memory written in your bones. Long before you understood what desire meant, it was already shaping you from within, like a sculptor working in clay that has not yet learned it is being molded. The invisible flame burned in your first breath, in the way your infant body curved toward warmth, in the wordless recognition that drew you toward the sustaining presence of another. This is the great mystery that depth psychology reveals. We do not create our desires so much as we are created by them. The unconscious does not wait for permission to love, to long, to reach across the void that separates one soul from another. It moves like water finding its course, like roots seeking nourishment in the dark soil of being. The ego, that conscious part of ourselves that believes it is the author of its own story, awakens one day to find that the story has already been writing itself, that the protagonist has been shaped by forces far older and more mysterious than rational thought. Consider the adolescent standing at the threshold between childhood and the great unknown of adulthood. Something stirs within them that they cannot name, something that makes the world suddenly dangerous and beautiful in ways they have never experienced. The body begins its own revolution, hormones flooding the system like rivers breaking their banks after the winter thaw. But this is not merely biology. This is the unconscious announcing itself, declaring that the time of innocence is ending and the time of transformation has begun. The young person finds themselves drawn to faces they cannot forget, to voices that echo in their dreams, to the magnetic pull of another's presence. They do not understand what is happening to them, cannot explain why a simple glance can shatter their composure, or why solitude suddenly feels like exile. They are experiencing the first conscious recognition of what has been true all along, that they are not separate beings moving through an indifferent universe, but interconnected souls drawn together by forces that predate thought itself. This awakening can be terrifying. The ego, which has spent years carefully constructing its sense of self, suddenly finds itself in the presence of something larger, something that refuses to be controlled or contained. The invisible flame burns away the comfortable illusions of independence, revealing the profound interdependence that lies at the heart of human existence. We discover that we are not the masters of our desire, but its servants, not the authors of our longing, but the vessels through which it expresses itself. And yet, this is not a diminishment, but an enlargement. To recognize the unconscious origin of desire is to step into the deeper current of life itself, to align ourselves with the creative force that moves through all things. The flame that burns within us is the same flame that burns in the stars, that drives the seasons in their eternal cycle, that compels the seed to break open in the dark earth and reach toward the light. In Jungian terms, this awakening marks the beginning of individuation, that lifelong process by which we come to know and integrate the various aspects of our psyche. But it begins not with consciousness, but with the unconscious recognition of our incompleteness, our fundamental need for what lies beyond the boundaries of the ego. Desire is the engine of individuation, the force that pulls us out of the comfortable prison of the known self and into the vast territory of becoming. The ancient alchemists understood this mystery. They spoke of the union of opposites, of the sacred marriage between masculine and feminine principles that creates the philosopher's stone, that symbol of wholeness and transformation. But they knew that this union could not be achieved through will alone, that it required a surrender to the deeper currents of the psyche, a willingness to be transformed by forces larger than the conscious mind. Sexual desire, in its deepest essence, is a manifestation of this alchemical process. It is the unconscious seeking its own completion, the fragmented soul reaching toward wholeness through union with another. This is why desire can feel both ecstatic and terrifying, why it can lift us to heights of transcendence and plunge us into depths of vulnerability. It touches something fundamental in our nature, something that knows we are not meant to remain forever isolated in the fortress of the ego. The persona, that mask we wear in our daily interactions with the world, often tries to domesticate this wildfire, to channel it into socially acceptable forms, to make it serve the needs of convention and propriety. But the invisible flame cannot be tamed so easily. It burns through our carefully constructed facades, revealing the raw truth of our longing, the fierce authenticity of our need for connection and completion. This is why the journey of sexual awakening is also a journey of psychological awakening. As we come to understand the nature of our desire, we begin to understand the nature of our psyche itself. We discover that what we thought was simple physical attraction is actually a complex interplay of projection and recognition, of seeing in another the qualities we long to possess ourselves, of finding in union with another a temporary resolution to the eternal tension between conscious and unconscious, between who we are and who we might become. The shadow, those aspects of ourselves that we have rejected or failed to acknowledge, often reveals itself most clearly in the realm of desire. We find ourselves drawn to qualities in others that we secretly possess but dare not express, attracted to the very characteristics we have disowned in ourselves. The unconscious uses desire as a mirror, showing us through our attractions what we need to integrate within ourselves. This is the profound wisdom hidden within sexual desire. It is not merely about the body seeking pleasure, though pleasure is certainly part of its sacred purpose. It is about the soul seeking recognition, completion, transformation. It is about the unconscious reaching toward consciousness through the bridge of intimate connection, using the language of the body to speak truths that words cannot capture. To invisible flame burns brightest in those moments when the boundaries of the self become permeable, when the ego's defenses soften, and we experience the profound truth of our interconnectedness. In these moments of surrender, we touch something eternal, something that existed before we were born and will continue after we are gone. We become participants in the great cosmic dance of union and separation, creation and dissolution, that governs all life. Yet this fire is not without its dangers. The unconscious forces that drive desire can overwhelm the conscious mind, leading to obsession, possession, and the loss of individual identity. The very power that can transform us can also destroy us if we are not wise in our relationship with it. This is why the development of consciousness is so crucial, not to control the flame, for that is impossible, but to learn to dance with it, to be transformed by it without being consumed by it. The wise person learns to honor both the fire and the vessel that contains it, to celebrate the unconscious wisdom of desire while developing the conscious capacity to channel it toward growth and healing rather than destruction and fragmentation. This is the great work of individuation, not to eliminate the primitive forces within us, but to bring them into conscious relationship, to make them allies in our journey toward wholeness. As we begin to understand the invisible flame that burns within us, we start to see that sexual desire is not separate from spiritual longing, but is rather one of its most powerful expressions. The same force that draws us toward physical union with another also draws us toward union with the deeper aspects of ourselves, toward the integration of shadow and light, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. This recognition transforms everything. What once seemed like simple biological urge reveals itself as a profound spiritual calling, an invitation to step beyond the narrow confines of the ego and into the vast mystery of becoming. The invisible flame becomes visible not as fire that burns, but as light that illuminates, showing us the path toward our own transformation and the transformation of our relationships with others. In this understanding, we begin to see that the unconscious origin of desire is not something to be feared or controlled, but something to be honored and integrated. It is the divine spark within us, the creative force that seeks expression through the sacred dance of intimacy and connection. To embrace this truth is to begin the great work of becoming fully human, fully alive, fully present to the magnificent complexity of our own being and the profound mystery of our connection with others. The invisible flame burns on, eternal and patient, waiting for us to recognize its sacred nature and learn to dance with its transformative power. In that recognition lies the beginning of all wisdom, all growth, all authentic relationship with ourselves and with the world around us. Beneath the polished surface of our civilized selves, something ancient stirs. It moves like an underground river carving channels through the bedrock of consciousness, shaping our choices in ways we dare not acknowledge. This is the primal creature that dwells within us all, older than language, deeper than thought, more powerful than the careful constructions of reason we use to navigate our daily lives. You can dress it in the finest fabrics of culture, educate it with the highest learning, surround it with the most sophisticated philosophies, but it remains what it has always been, a force of nature that recognizes no master save its own imperative to survive, to dominate, to perpetuate itself through the sacred act of creation. This is the tyranny of instinct, and we are all its subjects, whether we admit it or not. Jung understood this truth with the clarity of one who had gazed unflinchingly into the depths of the human psyche. He knew that beneath our personas, those carefully crafted masks we wear to navigate society, lies a wilderness of drives and impulses that stretch back to the very dawn of our species. We are not merely thinking beings who happen to have bodies. We are embodied creatures whose thoughts emerge from and are shaped by forces far more ancient than the development of the neocortex. The modern mind rebels against this recognition. We have been taught to believe that consciousness is the master of the house, that rational thought can control and direct the primitive impulses that surge through our neural pathways like storm tides. We create elaborate theories of behavior, modification, design complex systems of social control, and convince ourselves that we have evolved beyond our animal nature. But Jung knew better. He understood that repression is not mastery, but a form of fear. Fear of the raw power that moves through us. Fear of the implications of our own fundamental wildness. Watch a man in a boardroom, his suit pressed to perfection, his language measured and professional, his demeanor the very picture of civilized restraint. Yet beneath this carefully constructed facade, the ancient algorithms of dominance and submission play out with ruthless precision. His posture signals status. His voice modulates to assert authority. His eyes track the subtle hierarchies that govern every human interaction. He's not merely conducting business, he's participating in rituals as old as our species, claiming territory and establishing pecking orders through methods that would be instantly recognizable to any social primate. The sexual dimension of this primal drama cannot be separated from its other expressions. The drive to mate, to select the strongest partners, to ensure the survival of one's genetic legacy, operates through channels far more subtle and pervasive than the obvious manifestations of courtship and reproduction. It shapes our aesthetic preferences, our career ambitions, our social alliances, our very sense of identity and worth. The peacock's tail finds its human equivalent in the luxury car, the corner office, the designer clothing that signals reproductive fitness to potential mates who may not even be consciously present in our field of awareness. But this is not merely about men posturing in corporate environments or women adorning themselves to attract attention. The tyranny of instinct operates equally powerfully in both sexes, though it may express itself through different channels. The maternal instinct that can transform a gentle woman into a fierce protector, the competitive drive that can push someone to excel beyond all reasonable limits, the territorial impulses that make us defend our homes, our relationships, our beliefs with an intensity that surprises even ourselves. All of these are manifestations of the same primal programming that has ensured our survival across countless millennia. The shadow, that repository of all we have disowned about ourselves, is often most clearly revealed in our relationship to these instinctual drives. We project onto others the very qualities we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. The predatory nature we deny, the primitive hunger we repress, the raw sexuality we've been taught to sanitize or spiritualize beyond recognition. The person who loudly condemns promiscuity may be struggling with their own suppressed desires. The one who rails against aggression may be fighting to contain their own violent impulses. The individual who insists on the purely spiritual nature of love may be terrified of their own animal passion. This projection serves a psychological function, allowing us to maintain the illusion that we have transcended our biological nature, while simultaneously acknowledging its existence through our condemnation of it in others. But Jung warned against this false transcendence, this attempt to split ourselves into acceptable and unacceptable aspects. True individuation requires not the elimination of our instinctual nature, but its conscious integration, its transformation from an unconscious tyrant into a conscious ally. The archetypal patterns that govern human sexuality are written so deeply into our collective unconscious that they manifest across all cultures and throughout all of recorded history. The eternal triangle of lover, beloved, and rival, the cycle of pursuit, conquest, and loss. The dance of submission and dominance that plays out in bedrooms and boardrooms alike. These are not learned behaviors, but expressions of patterns that existed long before any individual consciousness emerged to observe them. Consider the archetype of the Great Mother, that primordial image that shapes our deepest understanding of feminine power. She appears in countless forms across human culture: the nurturing provider, the terrible destroyer, the source of life and the gateway to death. This archetype operates powerfully in the realm of sexuality, shaping both how women understand their own erotic nature and how men project their deepest longings and fears onto their female partners. The Madonna-whore complex, that familiar split that divides women into pure mothers and dangerous seductresses, is simply one manifestation of humanity's struggle to integrate the full spectrum of feminine archetypal energy. Similarly, the archetype of the divine masculine, The warrior, the king, the penetrating consciousness that seeks to impregnate the receptive void with meaning and form, operates through channels both obvious and subtle. It drives the competitive impulses that shape male sexuality, the need to prove worthiness through conquest and achievement, the identification of sexual potency with personal power and social status. But it also operates in women, manifesting as the animus, that inner masculine principle that seeks expression through achievement, assertion, and the drive to penetrate the mysteries of existence. The tragedy of our modern age is not that these archetypal forces exist within us. They are essential aspects of what makes us human, but that we have lost conscious relationship with them. We experience them as compulsions, rather than recognizing them as sacred energies that can be consciously channeled toward growth and creativity. We become victims of our own instincts, rather than learning to dance with them, to honor them while maintaining the consciousness necessary to direct them toward constructive rather than destructive ends. The man who cheats on his wife is often not simply seeking sexual gratification, but acting out an unconscious drama of conquest and possession that he cannot name or understand. The woman who finds herself repeatedly drawn to unavailable partners may be enacting an archetypal pattern of longing and loss that serves some deeper psychological purpose she has never consciously examined. These behaviors appear destructive and often are, but they also represent the psyche's attempt to work through fundamental issues of power, identity, and relationship that our conscious minds have failed to address. Enantiodromia, Jung's term for the tendency of things to transform into their opposites, operates powerfully in the realm of instinct and sexuality. The person who tries hardest to control their sexual nature often becomes its most complete slave. The one who denies their aggressive impulses may find themselves subject to sudden eruptions of violence. The individual who attempts to live purely by spirit may discover themselves dragged into the depths of material and sexual obsession. This is why Jung insisted that the path of individuation requires not the elimination of our shadow aspects, but their conscious integration. We cannot transcend what we refuse to acknowledge, cannot master what we will not face. The tyranny of instinct can only be broken not through repression, but through recognition, not through denial, but through dialogue. The unconscious does not yield to force, but responds to patient attention, to the kind of deep listening that allows us to hear the wisdom hidden within our wildest impulses. The sexual drive that seems to pull us toward destruction may actually be pointing towards some aspect of ourselves that needs to be born. The aggressive energy that frightens us with its intensity may contain the very power we need to break free from situations that have become toxic to our growth. But this recognition requires tremendous courage, for it means abandoning the comfortable fiction that we are purely rational beings in control of our own destiny. It means acknowledging that we are creatures of flesh and blood, shaped by forces that predate civilization, driven by needs and hungers that connect us to every living thing that has ever struggled to survive and reproduce on this planet. The modern therapeutic process often involves this descent into the primal layers of the psyche, this willingness to face the creature that lurks beneath our civilized surface. It is not comfortable work. To recognize the predator within ourselves, the part that would sacrifice others for our own survival and pleasure, challenges every ideal we hold about human nature and moral behavior. Yet without this recognition, we remain unconscious slaves to forces we cannot understand or direct. The integration of instinct does not mean becoming enslaved to it, but rather developing a conscious relationship with it. Like a skilled rider, learning to work with a powerful horse rather than fighting against it, we must learn to honor the energy of our primitive nature while maintaining the awareness necessary to direct it toward meaningful ends. This is the difference between being driven by instinct and being empowered by it, between being its victim and becoming its conscious partner. In this integration lies the possibility of genuine transformation. When we no longer fear the animal, within us, we can begin to appreciate its wisdom, the body's intelligence about what nourishes and what depletes, the intuitive recognition of compatible and incompatible energies, the profound biological wisdom that has kept our species alive across countless challenges and changes. The tyranny of instinct is broken not through conquest, but through recognition, not through control, but through conscious collaboration with the forces that have shaped us across the vast expanse of evolutionary time. In this collaboration, we discover that what seemed like our prison can become our greatest source of power, creativity, and authentic connection with the fundamental energies of life itself. In the basement of consciousness, something feeds in. Darkness. It grows fat on what we refuse to acknowledge, nourished by the very denials we use to maintain our carefully constructed sense of who we are. This is the shadow's hunger, insatiable, relentless, and infinitely creative in its methods of making itself known to a conscious mind that would prefer to remain ignorant of its existence. Jung understood that the shadow is not evil in itself, but rather the repository of all that we have deemed unacceptable about our nature. It is the brother we disown, the sister we refuse to claim, the aspect of ourselves that we have exiled to the dark territories beyond the reach of conscious recognition. And nowhere does this exiled energy express itself more powerfully, more destructively, and more creatively than in the realm of sexuality. The shadow's relationship to sexual desire is like that of a starved animal to fresh meat. Having been denied the light of conscious awareness, having been banished from the table of acceptable human experience, it becomes a devourer, consuming not only the energy that has been repressed, but growing ever larger, ever hungrier, ever more desperate in its attempts to break through the barriers that keep it imprisoned in the unconscious depths. Consider the man who presents himself to the world as the very picture of moral rectitude, whose public persona is built upon the foundation of sexual purity and spiritual transcendence. Behind closed doors, in the privacy of his own mind, or in the secret chambers of his computer, he may find himself compulsively drawn to exactly those forms of sexual expression that his conscious identity most vehemently condemns. The shadow, having been starved of natural expression, has become a ravenous beast that feeds on the very energy that was meant to nourish healthy sexuality. This is not hypocrisy in the simple sense, though it may appear so to the outside observer. It is the inevitable result of what Jung called the enantiodromia, the tendency of anything pushed to an extreme to transform into its opposite. The harder we push against our shadow nature, the more powerfully it pushes back. The more completely we identify with one pole of human experience, the more forcefully the opposite pole asserts itself from the unconscious depths. The shadow's hunger manifests not only in secret behaviors, but in the quality of our projections onto others. We become fascinated by exactly those individuals who embody what we have refused to acknowledge in ourselves. The repressed sensualist finds himself obsessed with those who express their sexuality freely. The denied aggressor becomes fixated on those who own their power openly. The disowned darkness seeks recognition through our compulsive interest in those who live without the moral constraints we have imposed upon ourselves. These projections carry an electric charge, a magnetic pull that can feel like love, but is actually a form of psychological cannibalism. We are not truly seeing the other person, but rather feeding on them as a source of the energy we have cut off from ourselves. The shadow uses these relationships as a kind of vampiric sustenance, drawing from others what it cannot access directly. From our own conscious awareness, the realm of sexual fantasy often becomes the shadow's primary feeding ground. Here, in the secret theater of the mind, all the roles we refuse to play in waking life can have their moment on stage. The submissive executive becomes the dominant master. The nurturing mother becomes the devouring temptress. The gentle healer becomes the violent conqueror. These fantasies are not necessarily pathological. They can be the psyche's way of attempting to achieve balance, of giving voice to aspects of our nature that have been silenced by social conditioning and personal choice. But when these shadow expressions remain completely unconscious, when they are never brought into dialogue with conscious awareness, they can become compulsive and destructive. The shadow's hunger, like any hunger that is never satisfied, grows more desperate and more indiscriminate in its feeding. What begins as an attempt to achieve psychological balance can evolve into addiction, obsession, or behavior that damages both self and others. The modern world, with its unprecedented access to sexual imagery and virtual experiences, has created new feeding grounds for the shadow's hunger. The internet becomes a vast buffet, where every repressed desire can find its corresponding image. Every denied impulse can discover its digital expression. For those who have lost conscious relationship with their shadow nature, this abundance can become a trap, an endless cycle of consumption that never truly satisfies because it is feeding the wrong hunger in the wrong way. The shadow's hunger is not really for more sexual stimulation, but for recognition, integration, and conscious relationship. It seeks not to be fed, but to be acknowledged, not to be satisfied, but to be understood. The compulsive consumption of sexual imagery, the endless scrolling through profiles on dating apps, the serial pursuit of increasingly extreme experiences, all of these can be seen as the shadow's desperate attempt to get the attention of a consciousness that has turned away from its own depths. Shame becomes both the cause and the effect of the shadow's exile. We banish aspects of our sexuality to the unconscious because we are ashamed of them, and their unconscious expression then creates more shame, which drives them deeper into the darkness. This creates a vicious cycle where the very attempt to maintain sexual purity creates its opposite, a secret life of sexual compulsion that becomes increasingly divorced from authentic intimacy and meaningful connection. The shadow knows no moral boundaries because it exists outside the realm of conscious choice and ethical consideration. It operates according to its own logic, which is the logic of the unconscious, symbolic, compensatory, and aimed not at moral behavior, but at psychological wholeness. When we judge the shadow's expressions by the standards of conscious morality, we miss the message it is trying to convey about what is missing from our conscious understanding of ourselves. This is why traditional approaches to sexual healing that focus solely on behavior modification or moral improvement often fail to address the root of the problem. They attempt to strengthen the very repressions that created the shadow's hunger in the first place, inadvertently feeding the cycle of denial and compulsion that keeps individuals trapped in patterns they consciously want to escape. True healing begins with the radical act of turning toward the shadow with curiosity rather than condemnation, with the willingness to ask not, "How can I get rid of these desires?" but rather, "What are these desires trying to tell me about aspects of myself that I have refused to acknowledge?" This requires immense courage, for it means facing parts of ourselves that we have spent lifetimes learning to despise or fear. Shadow's sexual expressions often carry within them clues to our deepest creative and spiritual potential. The person whose shadow craves dominance may need to own their natural leadership abilities. The individual whose repressed sexuality tends towards submission may need to learn the sacred art of surrender. the one whose fantasy life is filled with taboo scenarios, maybe being called to break free from conventional limitations that no longer serve their growth. But this integration cannot happen through the simple act of acting out shadow impulses. That would be to swing from repression to possession, from being the shadow's victim to being its slave. True integration requires the development of what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between conscious ideals and unconscious realities until a new synthesis emerges that honors both. This process is often accompanied by what feels like a death, the death of the old identity that was built upon the rejection of shadow aspects. The persona that was constructed through opposition to certain desires must dissolve to make room for a more complete and authentic sense of self. This can be terrifying, for it means releasing our grip on the familiar, even if the familiar has become a prison. The shadow's hunger is ultimately the soul's hunger for wholeness, for the integration of all aspects of our nature into a conscious unity that can embrace both light and dark, spirit and flesh, sacred and profane. When we learn to feed this hunger consciously, through honest self-examination, creative expression, authentic relationship, and the gradual expansion of our capacity to love all aspects of ourselves, the compulsive quality of shadow expression begins to transform. What was once driven and desperate becomes fluid and creative. What was hidden in shame can be expressed with dignity. What was fragmented and at war within us can find new forms of unity and collaboration. The shadow, no longer starved, no longer needs to devour. It can take its rightful place as a source of power, creativity, and authentic passion in a life that no longer fears its own depths. This transformation does not happen overnight, nor does it happen without periods of confusion, relapse, and apparent chaos. The shadow has been feeding in darkness for so long that bringing it into the light requires patience, compassion, and the willingness to make mistakes as we learn new ways of being with aspects of ourselves we have never consciously known. But the alternative, continuing to feed the shadow's hunger through unconscious compulsion while maintaining the fiction of conscious control, leads only to ever greater internal division and external destructiveness. The shadow, like any aspect of nature, cannot be permanently suppressed. It will find a way to express itself, and the longer it is denied conscious recognition, the more twisted and destructive its expressions are likely to become. The path of shadow integration in the realm of sexuality is ultimately a path of coming home to ourselves, to the full spectrum of our human nature, to the complete range of our capacity for pleasure, power, and intimate connection. It is the path from fragmentation to wholeness, from compulsion to choice, from shame to dignity. It is the path that leads not away from our sexuality, but through it, to a deeper understanding of what it means to be fully human in a world that has too often demanded we choose between spirit and flesh, between purity and passion, between who we pretend to be and who we actually are. In embracing the shadow's hunger, we discover that what we thought was our enemy was actually our teacher. What we believed was our weakness was actually our strength in disguise. And what we feared would destroy us was actually the very energy we needed to become whole. There is a strange and sacred violence in the moment we fall in love, not the violence of harm, but of rupture. The soul cracking open to something vast, unfamiliar, and unbearably beautiful. We speak of love as if it were a meeting between two people, but in truth it is a mirror being raised, and the gaze of our own forgotten self staring back at us through the veil of another's eyes. The beloved is not a stranger. They are the mask worn by the missing half of our soul. In the deepest chambers of the psyche, there lives a figure, fluid, luminous, unseen, For the man, she is the anima, the feminine soul image, keeper of feeling, instinct, and the mystery of life. For the woman, he is the animus, the inner masculine, voice of law, vision, and divine order. These are not mere ideas, they are archetypes, ancient patterns etched into the human unconscious. They are the eternal opposites living within us all, and they long for union. This longing is the origin of erotic attraction, not a desire born in the body, but a magnetic pull from the soul. In the presence of the beloved, the unconscious stirs and says, there is the one who can make me whole again. But it is never them. It is the lost god or goddess of our inner world, projected outward, clothed in skin, mistaken for salvation. A man meets a woman, and something inside him shivers. It is not simply her beauty, her voice, her scent. It is the anima awakened, the inner feminine, long repressed, now seen in flesh. He feels her mystery and thinks he has found eternity. But he has found only his own reflection, cast upon her like moonlight. She is not the goddess. She is the doorway, and a woman swept into the orbit of a man senses his strength, his silence, the myth he carries. Her animus has stirred. She sees, not merely a partner, but a king, a philosopher, a god. And yet it is her own inner masculine calling from within. She does not love him. She loves the image of herself that he awakens. This is projection, and projection is wholly illusion. It is the psyche's attempt to retrieve itself through another. It is the shadow of inner longing made visible in the world. But as with all shadows, it cannot last, for the beloved will fall, the goddess will bleed, the god will falter, and the temple of romance will crack beneath the weight of human frailty. Then comes the grief, not because love has died, but because the mirror has shattered, and we see the one we loved was never who we thought they were. This collapse is sacred. It is the death of fantasy, the funeral of projection, and like all symbolic deaths, it is the gateway to something deeper. Jung wrote that the projection of the anima or animus is the beginning, not the end, of relationship. To truly love is to retrieve the projection, to withdraw the divine from the other and find it again within. Only then can two souls meet, not as masks, but as beings. But the path is painful. To see that we never truly saw the other, to know we were loving a symbol, not a soul, is to stand at the threshold of disillusionment. It is the negredo of love, the blackening. The dream burns away, what remains is raw. But this is where love begins. For if we stay, if we dare to look past the ashes, we see the human, flawed, fragile, but real. And if we have done the inner work, we bring with us a new vision. We no longer demand divinity from the other. We see them not as savior, but as soul. Not as completion, but as companion. This is the second birth of love, and it is more sacred than the first. The anima and animus are not enemies. They are guides. They carry the voice of our becoming. But if left unconscious, they possess us. They turn us into addicts of fantasy, seekers of the impossible. The man who cannot see his anima within will worship her outside, in every woman he meets. But he will never be satisfied, for he is not seeking a partner, he is chasing his soul, and the woman, unconscious of her animus, will be drawn to men who reflect her own unclaimed authority. She may fall for the tyrant, the guru, the rebel, but she is not truly in love. She is seeking the masculine power she has not yet embraced in herself. The soul wants union, not with a person, but with itself. And sex becomes the stage on which this longing plays out. Erotic intimacy is not merely physical, it is ritual. It is the symbolic act of inner opposites seeking reunion. In the moment of orgasm, boundaries dissolve, time vanishes. For a breathless instant, we return to the womb of unity. But this moment is fleeting. The tragedy of our age is that we pursue this moment endlessly, mistaking the symbol for the substance. We believe sex will save us, that love will make us whole. But it is not the other we need. It is the marriage of our own inner masculine and feminine, the sacred inner hieros gamos, the alchemical union of opposites within. This is the task of individuation, to meet the anima not as seductress, but as soul guide, to face the animus not as tyrant, but as sacred voice, to bring them into dialogue, to allow them to teach us, wound us, and ultimately transform us. The anima teaches the man to feel, to descend from intellect into the mystery of emotion. She softens his rigid edges, reconnects him to nature, to beauty, to vulnerability. When she is integrated, he no longer seeks the goddess outside. He becomes her, and the animus teaches the woman to speak, to rise from silence into clarity. He brings structure to her depths, protects her intuition with form and fire. When she claims him, she no longer worships the hero. She becomes sovereign. This is not a betrayal of romance, it is its transfiguration. When two individuals have met and integrated their inner opposites, their love is no longer based on need, projection, or fantasy. It is grounded in soul. They do not seek to complete each other, but to walk beside one another. Mirrors not of illusion, but of truth. This is rare. For it requires descent. It requires the death of every romantic fantasy, every myth of salvation, every illusion of the perfect partner. It requires sitting in the ashes of disillusionment and asking, who was I truly in love with? Was it them, or the part of me they carried? And then, in the silence, to begin the work of calling that part home. Imagine this. A man dreams of a woman who lives in the forest. She says nothing, only watches him. He follows her deeper and deeper into the trees, until he finds a mirror where her face should be. And in the mirror, his own eyes, crying. This is the anima, or a woman hears a voice in her mind. Stern, clear, unyielding. It judges her, compels her, commands her to be more. She fears it, she obeys it. But one day she turns toward it and sees that it is not a man, but a star burning inside her chest. This is the animus. When these inner figures are honored, not repressed, not projected, they become allies. The man writes poetry. The woman finds her voice. The inner world becomes whole, and then, when they meet another, not from hunger but from fullness, the relationship becomes a vessel, a crucible, a temple. There comes a moment, quiet as snowfall, when we fall in love. But the fall is not what we think. It is not the other we fall into. It is ourselves. Or more precisely, the part of ourselves we have never met, never dared to touch, never had the eyes to see. In the eyes of the beloved, something ancient stirs, an ache, a nostalgia, a whisper from the soul's hidden chapel. We call it passion, attraction, chemistry, but what it is beneath the heat and trembling is projection, a mirror held up by the hand of fate, reflecting not the other, but our own soul's silhouette. Jung called it the anima in man and the animus in woman, the inner feminine and the inner masculine. The soul images buried within us, formed from the sediment of centuries, molded by our earliest impressions of love, nurturance, power, and mystery. When we fall in love, we are not choosing freely. We are compelled. The inner figures rise from the depths of the unconscious and possess the heart with a holy fire. A man, when seized by the anima, believes he has found the goddess. She appears to him veiled in mortal skin, but her voice sings from the ancient forest of his longing. She is the siren, the maiden, the muse. And yet she is not her. She is him, his inner feminine, the part of his soul that holds intuition, feeling, receptivity, mystery. She is the moonlight within his sun, and in his hunger for her, he is truly hungering for his own soul's lost half. Likewise, a woman, drawn by the animus, sees in him the hero, the sage, the knight in dark armor. He is her idea of logos, thought, structure, will. He speaks with the voice of fate, promising destiny, strength and meaning. But it is not him she loves, it is her animus cloaked in flesh, the inner masculine she longs to marry within. These are not casual desires. They are sacred psychodramas, echoing the soul's deepest yearning, to be whole. We do not fall in love with others, we fall in love with our projected selves. And in the realm of sex, this becomes holy theatre, a ritual of merging, of momentary union with the divine reflection. But there is a cost, because projections are fragile. They cannot endure the slow gravity of time. The beloved will eventually disappoint. She will reveal her mortality. He will stumble from the pedestal. And the mirage of perfection will crack. Then what was once divine becomes diabolical. We feel betrayed, not because the other has changed, but because the mask we placed upon them has fallen. The spell is broken, and the mirror turns to ash. This is the moment of awakening or despair. For those willing to see, this is the sacred threshold. The anima and animus have done their task. They lured us inward. Now the real work begins. To retrieve the projection, to reabsorb it, and to discover the living soul behind the fantasy. Every great love carries this fire. It burns through illusion, not to destroy love, but to purify it. The ego clings to romance. The soul yearns for union. True relationship begins when the projection ends. Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But first, the masks must burn. Sex is not just biology, it is initiation. It opens the portal to the unconscious. In the moment of erotic union, time dissolves, boundaries vanish, and the soul, if even for an instant, feels whole again. But it is a borrowed wholeness. A glimpse, not a possession. The tragedy of modern love is that we chase the glimpse as if it were the goal. We mistake projection for compatibility. We confuse possession with connection. We want the other to complete us instead of seeing them as the vessel through which we glimpse our own incompletion. When the anima is unconscious, a man becomes enslaved to image. He worships the feminine ideal, always chasing, never satisfied. He projects her onto every woman, then resents her for failing to be divine. He lives in erotic exile, never at home within himself. His dreams are filled with sirens and goddesses, his waking life with disappointment. Likewise, the unconscious animus in a woman leads her into relationships with dominating, aloof, or messianic men, figures she cannot quite touch, yet cannot abandon. Her soul speaks in strong opinions, inner critics, or grand visions, but beneath it all is a yearning for a masculine she can trust, not out there, but within. These inner figures, anima and animus, are bridges to the self. They are not enemies to be banished, but guides to be known. When we engage them consciously, they soften, they become allies, not tyrants. The anima becomes the muse, the wellspring of creativity. The animus becomes the voice of wisdom, the architect of truth. But to reach that inner marriage, we must endure the disillusionment of outer love. We must see the mirror for what it is, not a lie, but a symbol, a reflection of our own souls. Longing cast upon the flesh of another, imagine a man gazing at a woman and feeling a tidal pull in his chest. He is not just desiring her body, he is hearing the echo of his own lost soul, singing through her laughter, her eyes, her mystery. If he understands this, he does not need to possess her. He bows to her as the messenger of something holy, or a woman who meets a man and feels the electricity of fate. If she is unaware, she may give him her power. But if she sees with the eye of soul, she recognizes that what she loves in him is the flame of her own becoming. He is not the hero, he is the call to awaken her own inner strength. This is the sacred work of relationship, not to find the perfect other, but to use the mirror they offer to find the forgotten self. The Greeks knew this. In Plato's Symposium, Aristophanes tells the myth that we were once whole, both masculine and feminine, until the gods split us in half. Since then, we wander the earth searching for our missing part. But Jung takes us deeper. The missing. A part is not another person. It is within. The lover is not the answer. They are the mirror pointing us back to the question of wholeness, to make the unconscious conscious, to retrieve the projection, to integrate the anima and animus, not by fantasy, but by the slow work of inner union. This is why sex wounds and awakens. It breaks us open, not to punish, but to reveal what has been hidden. It invites us into mystery, into longing, into the alchemical vessel of transformation. For in the end, all true love is alchemy. The heat of desire, the blackness of loss, the dissolution of illusion, and finally, the gold of integration. When we stop worshipping the other and begin honoring the mirror they offer, we step into maturity. We become sovereign, no longer chasing the goddess or the hero in outer form, but awakening them within. We no longer need love to save us. We love to see ourselves more clearly, and yet, paradoxically, it is in this seeing that love becomes more real. Not a fantasy, but a flame. Not a prison of projection, but a path of becoming. The beloved remains, but they are no longer the idol. They are the companion, the fellow traveler, the one who, by simply being, helps us remember what we once were, and what we are still becoming. This is the mirror of the other, a sacred glass not to be clung to, but to be honored, shattered, and reassembled into something deeper than romance, into soul. In the end, every sexual attraction is a cipher, a sacred code. It asks, what do you see in them that you have not yet found in yourself? And more importantly, are you willing to go there? There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the ground beneath us dissolves, when the carefully constructed edifice of who we believed ourselves to be crumbles into dust. This is not failure. This is arrival. You have entered the negredo, the blackening, the sacred dissolution that precedes all true rebirth. The alchemists knew what we have forgotten, that gold emerges only from the complete putrefaction of base matter. They understood that consciousness, like precious metal, must first be reduced to its primordial chaos before it can be transformed into something luminous. You stand now at the threshold of this ancient mystery, where the ego meets its necessary death. Feel how the familiar world has become strange. The person you were yesterday seems like a ghost haunting your periphery. The desires that once drove you forward now taste of ash. This is not depression. This is descent. You are being pulled into the underworld of your own psyche, where the real work begins. Sex becomes the gateway here, not as pleasure, but as portal. When we strip away the fantasies, the projections, the elaborate stories we tell ourselves about love and desire, what remains is raw encounter with the other, and through that other, with the terrifying depths of ourselves. The erotic in its most honest form reveals our desperate hunger for dissolution, our secret longing to be annihilated and remade. In the crucible of intimate encounter, the ego's carefully maintained boundaries begin to blur. You reach for another body, another soul, seeking completion, seeking wholeness, but what you find instead is your own fragmentation reflected back at you. The beloved becomes a mirror in which you see not love, but need, not unity, but separation, not transcendence, but the raw wound of human longing. This is where heartbreak teaches its deepest lessons. When the object of our desire withdraws, when love curdles into betrayal, when obsession reveals itself as spiritual hunger misdirected, Toward human flesh, we are thrown into the abyss of our own emptiness. The nigredo begins in earnest. The dark night of the soul is not metaphor, but literal experience. You wake at 3 in the morning with your heart racing, pursued by dreams you cannot remember, but whose emotional residue clings to you like smoke. The daylight world feels thin, translucent, as if reality itself has become questionable. You move through familiar spaces as a stranger to yourself. This is the psychological equivalent of death. The person you were is decomposing, breaking down into constituent elements. Your old strategies for meaning-making have become useless. Your former sources of identity, career, relationships, beliefs, dreams, lie scattered around you like broken pottery. You are being composted by life itself. In this dissolution, obsession often emerges as the psyche's desperate attempt to maintain coherence. We fixate on someone, something, some external savior who might pull us back from this edge. But obsession, in the nigredo, is different from ordinary attachment. It carries the quality of possession, of being overtaken by autonomous forces that seem to arise from somewhere beyond conscious will. The beloved becomes numinous, charged with archetypal energy that has little to do with their actual person. They become the container for our projections of wholeness, the imagined key to our completion. We chase them through the labyrinth of our own unconscious, not understanding that we are pursuing our own shadow, our own unredeemed fragments disguised as another. Betrayal arrives as teacher here, stripping away our illusions about human love, human constancy, human nature itself. The one we trusted reveals their capacity for deception. The one we idealized shows us their shadow. The one we needed abandons us to our own darkness, and in this abandonment we are forced to confront what we have been running from all along, ourselves. But betrayal is sacred work. It shatters the false unity we have constructed between ourselves and our projections. It burns away the fantasy of being saved by another, loved into wholeness by external grace. It forces us to meet our own need, our own emptiness, our own desperate hunger for meaning without the mediating comfort of human relationship. In the depths of nigredo, sexuality itself transforms. Stripped of romantic illusion, it reveals its connection to death, to dissolution, to the primordial chaos from which consciousness emerged. The French call orgasm la petite mort, the little death, and in the throes of physical passion, we glimpse what waits for us in the greater dissolution. But this death is not ending, it is transformation. In the moment of sexual surrender, the ego's boundaries dissolve temporarily, giving us a taste of the unity that lies beyond our ordinary fragmented consciousness. We touch something vast and impersonal, something that exists before and after the story of our individual lives. This is why sex in the nigredo becomes so charged, so desperate, so seeking. We are not just reaching for physical pleasure, but for temporary escape from the prison of separate selfhood. We are seeking to return, however briefly, to the undifferentiated ocean of being from which we emerged. We are practicing for our own death and rebirth. The shadow emerges fully here, no longer content to remain hidden in the unconscious. All the aspects of ourselves we have rejected, denied, or suppressed come flooding into consciousness. We discover our capacity for cruelty, for selfishness, for darkness we never imagined we contained. We see how our love has been contaminated by need, our generosity by hidden expectation, our virtue by secret pride. This confrontation with shadow is devastating but necessary. We cannot integrate what we will not acknowledge. We cannot heal what we refuse to see. The nigredo forces us to witness our own complexity, our own capacity for both creation and destruction, our own participation in the very suffering we thought we were merely victims of. Mythology understands this descent. Inanna must be stripped naked and hung on hooks in the underworld before she can return transformed. Persephone must be taken into Hades' realm before she can become queen of both worlds. Christ must die on the cross before resurrection becomes possible. The hero's journey always leads through the valley of death. You are living this ancient pattern now. The forces that seem to be destroying you are actually preparing you for a different kind of existence. The ego that is dying was never your true self anyway. It was just a costume you wore, a role you played, a limited version of your infinite nature. In the blackness of Negredo, something is gestating, like seeds buried in winter soil, like caterpillars dissolving in the chrysalis, like stars forming in the darkness between galaxies. New consciousness is taking shape in the void. You cannot see it yet. You can only feel the destruction of what was. This is the alchemical mystery, that consciousness must return to prima materia, to original chaos, before it can be reconstituted at a higher level. You are being broken down to your essential elements so that you can be rebuilt according to a pattern more aligned with your deepest nature. The erotic impulse that brought you here, that threw you into this crisis of dissolution, was never really about the other person at all. It was your soul's longing for its own completion, its own integration, its own return to wholeness. The beloved was just the catalyst, the trigger that initiated the alchemical process already waiting within you. Now, in the depths of this dark night, you begin to understand. The love you sought outside yourself was always meant to be found within. The completion you imagined another could provide was always your own work to accomplish. The union you craved was always the marriage of your own inner opposites. The conscious and unconscious, the masculine and feminine, the light and shadow aspects of your being. This recognition brings its own form of grief. You mourn the death of the fantasy that someone else could save you. You grieve the loss of the romantic dream that love could exempt you from the work of your own becoming. You say goodbye to the child within who believed that if you were just good enough, lovable enough, perfect enough, you would be protected from life's essential loneliness. But in this grief lies liberation. When you no longer need another person to complete you, you become free to love them as they are, rather than as projections of your own need. When you accept your fundamental aloneness, you discover a solitude that is not empty, but full of your own presence, your own being, your own inexhaustible depth. The Negredo teaches us that transformation is not a gentle process. It is violent, chaotic, often terrifying. It strips away everything we thought we knew about ourselves and leaves us raw, exposed, defenseless. But in this defenselessness, we discover our true strength. In this nakedness, we find our authentic beauty. In this dissolution, we touch our eternal nature. You are dying into life. You are falling apart into wholeness. You are descending into the darkness to discover the light that has always lived at your core. This is not punishment. This is initiation. This is not breakdown. This is breakthrough disguised as its opposite. The Negredo ends not when the pain stops, but when you stop fighting the pain. It concludes not when you find answers, but when you become comfortable living in the questions. It completes itself not when you achieve some imagined perfection, but when you embrace your own beautiful, terrible, necessary imperfection. From the ashes of who you were, something unprecedented is preparing to emerge. You cannot know yet what that will be. You can only trust the process, surrender to the dissolution, and allow yourself to be transformed by forces larger and wiser than your conscious mind. The descent into darkness is really an ascent into depth. The death you are dying is really birth into a larger life. The Negredo is not the end of your story, it is the beginning of a chapter written in a language you are only now learning to speak. In the crucible of your own dissolution, gold is being formed. Beneath every adult hunger lies a child's first wound. Beneath every reach for another's body lives a memory of the original touch that was absent, withheld, or given conditionally. You carry within you an orphan who has never stopped searching for home, never stopped believing that the right embrace might finally heal what was broken before you had words to name your breaking. This is the sacred wound. Sacred, not because it is holy, but because it is the crack through which your deepest truths enter the world. It is the place where your soul learned to speak the language of longing, where your heart first discovered that love and pain are often indistinguishable, where your body memorized patterns of reaching and withdrawal that would echo through every relationship that followed. The orphan archetype lives in all of us, regardless of whether we were literally abandoned. It emerges wherever a child's essential needs went unmet, not just for food and shelter, but for presence, for witnessing, for unconditional acceptance of their whole being. The orphan is born wherever love came with conditions, wherever safety required performance, wherever belonging demanded the sacrifice of authentic self. Feel how this ancient wound pulses beneath your adult desire. When you reach for another with desperate intensity, you're not just reaching for their body, you're reaching back across time toward the parent who was absent, the caregiver who was distracted, the early love that taught you that your needs were too much, too hungry, too overwhelming to be met without reservation. The erotic becomes a theater where these primal dramas replay themselves endlessly. The beloved's withdrawal triggers not just current disappointment, but the accumulated anguish of every time you were left alone with your need. Their presence floods you not just with present pleasure, but with the profound relief of a child who finally finds themselves seen and held without having to earn it. But here lies the tragedy and the possibility. The adult lovers we choose cannot heal the child's wound. They carry their own orphans, their own sacred wounds, their own unconscious hunger for what was never given. When two orphans meet in the darkness of physical intimacy, they create a beautiful, desperate attempt at mutual salvation that is doomed to repeat the original abandonment. This is why sexual relationships often become such battlegrounds of projection and disappointment. We bring to them the weight of our earliest injuries, expecting our lover to be the perfect parent we never had, the ultimate witness to our hidden self, the one who will finally prove that we are worthy of unending love. When they inevitably fail to fulfill this impossible role, we experience not just adult disappointment, but the full force of childhood devastation. The pattern reveals itself. Attraction often follows the blueprint of your original wound. If you were abandoned, you find yourself drawn to unavailable people. If you were smothered, you crave partners who give you space to breathe. If you were criticized, you seek those who seem to offer unconditional acceptance, or paradoxically, those whose approval feels worth earning because it comes so rarely. Your nervous system learned its rhythms in those early relationships, and it recognizes familiar music even decades later. The dance of pursuit and withdrawal, the cycle of intimacy and distance, the particular flavor of tension that signals both danger and the possibility of love. These patterns live in your body like muscle memory, guiding you toward what feels like home, even when home was a place of pain. The orphan within you carries specific longings that shape your erotic life in ways you may not recognize. If you were the child who had to be perfect to earn love, you might find yourself drawn to sexual scenarios where you can finally be messy, wild, uncontrolled. If you were the child whose emotional intensity was too much for your caregivers, you might crave lovers who can meet you in the fullness of your passion without withdrawing. But the orphan also carries terror, terror of abandonment, of rejection, of discovering that you are indeed too much or not enough. This terror shapes your sexuality as much as your longing does. You might find yourself holding back your deepest desires, afraid that full expression of your needs will drive the other away. Or you might find yourself giving more than you want to give, hoping that if you can just be good enough, loving enough, sexually generous enough, you can prevent the inevitable departure. The sacred wound creates what we might call erotic confusion. The inability to distinguish between past and present, between the lover in your bed and the parent who was absent from your childhood, between current relationship dynamics and ancient patterns of survival. This confusion is not pathology, but the soul's attempt to heal itself through repetition, to master old trauma by recreating it in new contexts where different outcomes might be possible. Consider how your childhood experiences of love shaped your relationship to your own body. If touch came only when you were hurt or sick, you might find yourself unconsciously creating crises to justify intimacy. If affection was withheld as punishment, you might carry shame about your own desires, believing that wanting too much makes you unlovable. If physical closeness was associated with violation of boundaries, you might struggle with the vulnerability that authentic sexuality requires. The body remembers everything. It holds the imprint of every early touch, every withdrawal of touch, every moment when your need for contact was met with presence or absence. These cellular memories influence not just whom you desire, but how you desire, with confidence or apology, with trust or guardedness, with the expectation of fulfillment or the certainty of disappointment. The orphan's wound is often deepest around the experience of being truly seen. Most children learn to hide parts of themselves that seem to threaten their connection to their caregivers. They develop what Jung called the persona, the mask that shows the world only what appears safe to show. But the hidden parts don't disappear. They go underground, waiting for someone who might love them back into the light. Sexuality becomes one of the few realms where these hidden aspects can emerge. In the vulnerability of physical intimacy behind closed doors, in the darkness of shared desire, the orphan hopes to be met in their wholeness, not just the acceptable parts, but the needy, angry, frightened, wild aspects that had to be concealed. For survival, the beloved becomes the witness the child always needed, the one who might see everything and not turn away. But this hope carries its own terror. What if you are seen completely and found lacking? What if your hidden self proves to be as unlovable as you've always feared? The orphan both craves and dreads the very visibility that might heal them, creating an internal conflict that can make sexual intimacy simultaneously the most desired and most frightening experience imaginable. The patterns of childhood also shape your relationship to power in erotic contexts. If you were powerless as a child, you might find yourself drawn to scenarios where you can experience control, where your desires matter, where your needs take precedence. Or conversely, you might be drawn to surrender, to the relief of not having to be responsible, of being cared for without having to ask. If you had too much responsibility as a child, perhaps caring for unstable parents or younger siblings, you might crave relationships where you can finally be the one who is held, protected, cherished. Or you might find yourself unconsciously recreating familiar patterns of caretaking, even in your most intimate relationships, unable to receive without giving first. The sacred wound often reveals itself in what feels missing in your sexual relationships. The orphan seeks not just physical pleasure, but reparation, the chance to have needs met that were never met, to receive attention that was never given, to be chosen in a way that feels like coming home to yourself. When sex fails to provide this impossible healing, disappointment follows not just from present circumstances, but from the accumulated disappointment of a lifetime. Yet within this wound, lies your deepest wisdom. The orphan's sensitivity to abandonment can become exquisite attunement to connection. The child who learned to read emotional atmospheres for signs of danger can become gifted at sensing what others need. The young heart that was broken early can grow into a mature heart, capable of holding both your own and others' pain with extraordinary compassion. The sacred wound is also the source of your particular gifts. Perhaps your early experience of loss made you deeply empathetic to others' suffering. Perhaps your childhood loneliness developed your capacity for solitude and inner richness. Perhaps your early experience of being different or rejected gave you permission to be authentically yourself in ways that those who were always accepted never learned. The journey toward healing the sacred wound does not require finding the perfect lover who will be the parent you never had. It requires gradually becoming that perfect parent to the orphan within yourself. It asks you to learn to see your own needs without shame, to hold your own longings with tenderness, to provide yourself with the unconditional acceptance you once sought from others. This internal reparenting transforms your erotic life from desperate searching into conscious choice. When you no longer need another person to validate your worth, you become free to desire them for who they are, rather than for what they might heal in you. When you learn to hold your own vulnerability with compassion, you can share that vulnerability as a gift rather than a demand for salvation. The orphan's journey is ultimately about coming home to yourself, not to the self you think you should be, but to the self you actually are, including all the parts that carry wounds, needs, and unfulfilled longings. This homecoming allows authentic intimacy to emerge, intimacy based not on mutual rescue, but on mutual recognition of each other's full humanity. Your sacred wound is not a flaw to be fixed, but a doorway to be entered. It holds the key to your deepest capacity for love, for creativity, for connection to the suffering and joy that unite all human hearts. In learning to honor your own wound, you learn to honor the wounded child in every person you encounter, creating the possibility for relationships based not on fantasy, but on the profound tenderness that emerges when two real people meet in their shared humanity. The orphan in you may never be completely healed, but they can be loved. And in that loving transformation becomes possible not the transformation that erases the past, but the transformation that integrates it into a larger story of resilience, compassion, and the endless capacity of the human heart to turn wounds into wisdom, pain into power, and longing into the very force that connects us all. There comes a moment when you realize you're no longer choosing, you are being chosen. The desire that once felt like freedom has become a prison. The passion that once seemed like self-expression has become a compulsion that expresses itself through you. You have crossed the threshold from conscious eroticism into possession by autonomous forces that Jung called complexes, archetypal patterns that take over the psyche and live their own life through your body, your choices, your very soul. This is what it means to be possessed by Eros. The god of love and desire has claimed you not as a willing participant, but as an unwilling vessel. Your sexuality is no longer your own. It belongs to something ancient, powerful, and indifferent to your conscious intentions. You find yourself acting out patterns that feel both foreign and familiar, as if you are remembering a script written long before you were born. The signs of possession are unmistakable once you learn to recognize them. Your behavior becomes repetitive, compulsive, beyond the reach of rational decision-making. You find yourself drawn again and again to the same types of relationships, the same destructive patterns, the same scenarios that promise fulfillment, but deliver only temporary relief, followed by deeper emptiness. You have become a character in a story you did not write, playing out a role that was carved into the collective unconscious millennia ago. The archetypal lover possesses you with the promise of transcendence through union. Under its influence, you become convinced that the right person, the perfect encounter, the ultimate sexual experience, will finally deliver you from the ache of existence. You chase this phantom completion through body after body, relationship after relationship, always believing that this time will be different. This time will be the one that finally satisfies the hunger that has no bottom. But the archetypal lover is not interested in your actual satisfaction. It feeds on the pursuit itself, on the endless cycle of desire and temporary fulfillment that keeps you in motion. It whispers that you are just one encounter away from the ecstasy that will justify all your restless searching. It promises transcendence, but delivers only the eternal repetition of the same unfulfilled longing. Under the lover's possession, you may find yourself making choices that contradict your values, your commitments, your rational understanding of what is good for you. You betray partners who love you for strangers, who offer nothing but momentary intensity. You risk your health, your reputation, your stability for experiences that last only hours. You live in a state of constant internal conflict, torn between the part of you that knows better and the part that cannot stop reaching for the next fix. The succubus archetype manifests differently but with equal power. This is the archetypal pattern of the seductive feminine that drains life force through sexual encounter. When possessed by the succubus, you may find yourself using sexuality as a weapon, a tool for power and control rather than connection. You become skilled at recognizing others' vulnerabilities and exploiting them for your own gratification. The succubus operates through the dark feminine's power to entrance and consume. Under its influence, you may discover abilities you never knew you possessed, the capacity to read desire in others' eyes, to sense exactly what they need and use that knowledge to bind them to you. You become a master of seduction, not out of love, but out of a vampiric need to feed on others' energy, attention, and life force. But possession by the succubus is ultimately self-destructive. Those who serve this archetype often find themselves increasingly isolated, surrounded by people who desire them but do not truly know them. The power to seduce becomes a barrier to authentic intimacy, as you begin to relate to others only through the lens of conquest and consumption. You may achieve sexual power, but lose the capacity for genuine connection. The Don Juan archetype represents the masculine version of this possession, the eternal seducer who conquers but never surrenders, who takes but never gives, who moves from conquest to conquest without ever allowing himself to be touched by genuine intimacy. Under Don Juan's influence, you become addicted to the hunt, the chase, the moment of victory when another falls under your spell. Don Juan's possession manifests as an inability to be satisfied by any single encounter or relationship. There is always another conquest waiting, another challenge to overcome, another ego to seduce. The Don Juan archetype feeds on novelty and variety, convincing you that commitment is death, that monogamy is a trap, that your sexual appetite is too vast and varied to be contained within conventional boundaries. But beneath Don Juan's apparent freedom lies a profound terror of intimacy, of being truly known, of allowing another to see past the seductive persona to the vulnerable human. Beneath, the endless pursuit of new conquests becomes a way of avoiding the deeper work of authentic relationship, of genuine encounter with another's full humanity. These archetypal possessions often begin innocuously enough. You may initially experience them as liberation from sexual shame or inhibition. The lover archetype seems to free you from the constraints of conventional morality, encouraging you to follow your desires wherever they lead. The succubus or Don Juan patterns may initially feel empowering, giving you a sense of sexual agency and power you never had before. But what begins as liberation gradually reveals itself as a different kind of prison. The freedom to pursue any desire becomes the compulsion to pursue every desire. The power to seduce becomes the inability to stop seducing, even when seduction is inappropriate or harmful. What felt like expansion of your erotic self becomes constriction into a single repetitive pattern. The autonomous nature of these complexes is perhaps most evident in their resistance to conscious intervention. You may recognize the destructive patterns you are caught in, may genuinely desire to change, may even seek therapy or spiritual guidance to break free. But the archetypal forces possess a life of their own that operates independently of your conscious will. You find yourself acting out the same patterns despite your best intentions, as if you are watching yourself from outside your own body. This experience of being taken over by forces beyond conscious control can be deeply frightening. It challenges our modern belief in individual agency and rational decision-making. It confronts us with evidence that we are not the masters of our own psyche, but are instead inhabited by powers that were ancient when our species was young. Jung understood that these archetypal possessions are not simply personal pathology, but expressions of collective human patterns that have been constellated in the psyche for thousands of years. The lover, the succubus, the Don Juan, these are not individual neuroses, but transpersonal forces that have found expression through countless human lives across cultures and centuries. The mythological traditions of every culture contain stories of possession by erotic forces. Greek mythology speaks of mortals driven mad by the gods of love and desire. Hindu traditions describe the possession of devotees by divine lovers. Shamanic cultures worldwide recognize the reality of spiritual beings that can inhabit human bodies and express themselves through human sexuality. What our ancestors understood as literal possession by gods or spirits, depth psychology recognizes as activation of archetypal patterns within the unconscious. But the phenomenology, the lived experience, remains remarkably similar. The sense of being taken over by forces beyond personal control, of acting out patterns that feel both foreign and familiar, of being compelled to repeat behaviors that your rational mind knows are destructive. Breaking free from archetypal possession requires first recognizing that you are possessed. This is often the most difficult step, as the archetypal forces are skilled at convincing you that their desires are your own desires, their needs are your authentic needs. They operate through rationalization, through elaborate justifications that make destructive behavior seem not only reasonable, but necessary. The possessed person often becomes a masterful storyteller, spinning narratives that explain away the obvious contradictions in their behavior. The lover archetype convinces you that your endless pursuit of new relationships is actually a spiritual quest for transcendence. The succubus persuades you that your manipulation of others is really helping them discover their own desires. Chaka. One insists that his inability to commit is actually a gift to his partners, freeing them from the burden of his complex nature. Recognition of possession often comes through its effects on others. You begin to notice the trail of broken relationships, the pattern of people who start with excitement about knowing you and end with hurt, confusion, or anger. You see how your behavior affects not just yourself, but everyone who enters your orbit. The autonomous complex may not care about the collateral damage it creates, but your human heart eventually recognizes the cost. The process of freeing yourself from archetypal possession is not a matter of simply deciding to stop. These patterns have their own intelligence, their own survival mechanisms, their own ways of reasserting control when you try to break free. They may temporarily retreat only to return with greater force when your guard is down. Liberation requires what Jung called making the unconscious conscious, bringing the archetypal patterns into the light of awareness where they can be examined, understood, and ultimately integrated rather than simply acted out. This means developing the capacity to observe your own behavior with compassion rather than judgment, to recognize the archetypal forces at work without being overwhelmed by shame or self-hatred. The goal is not to destroy these archetypal energies. They are part of the fundamental structure of the human psyche and cannot be eliminated without damaging the whole. Instead, the goal is to develop a conscious relationship with them, to learn when they are influencing your behavior, and to choose how to respond rather than being automatically compelled to act. This requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposing forces within the psyche without being torn apart by them. You learn to acknowledge the archetypal hunger without immediately acting on it, to feel the pull of the complex without being dragged into its orbit. The transformation of possession into conscious relationship with archetypal forces is one of the most profound shifts possible in human development. It represents the movement from being lived by unconscious patterns to living consciously with them. It transforms you from a victim of archetypal forces into a conscious participant in the eternal human dramas they represent. When the lover archetype is integrated rather than possessing, it becomes a source of genuine devotion rather than compulsive seeking. When the succubus or Don Juan energies are conscious, they can be channeled into creativity, into the power to attract and inspire others in service of something greater than personal gratification. This integration does not eliminate the intensity of these archetypal energies, it transforms them. The possessed person's sexuality is often dramatic and overwhelming, but ultimately repetitive and empty. The integrated person's sexuality may be no less intense, but it becomes conscious, chosen, and connected to their deeper humanity rather than separate from it. The journey from possession to integration is the journey from being unconsciously lived by archetypal forces to consciously living with them. It is the movement from compulsion to choice, from repetition to creativity, from isolation to authentic connection. It represents nothing less than the transformation of your relationship to the most fundamental forces of life itself. Beyond the realm of projection and possession lies a different kind of sexuality, one that serves not the hungry ego or the autonomous complex, but the deeper process of individuation itself. Here, in the sacred chamber of conscious union, sexuality transforms from unconscious compulsion into alchemical art, from desperate seeking into purposeful creation, from fragmented yearning into the hieros gamos, the holy marriage that occurs, not between two separate beings, but between the opposing forces within your own soul. This is the sexuality of wholeness, where the external embrace becomes a mirror of the internal integration happening at the deepest levels of your being. When you touch another from this place, you are simultaneously touching the masculine and feminine principles within yourself, allowing them to meet, to dance, to create something entirely new in the crucible of conscious relationship. The alchemists understood this mystery. Their elaborate diagrams of kings and queens, suns and moons, gold and silver dissolving into each other were never primarily about chemical processes. They were maps of the psyche's journey toward integration, blueprints for the inner marriage that transforms the base matter of unconscious sexuality into the gold of conscious union. In this sacred sexuality, the beloved becomes not the object of your projections, but the catalyst for your own inner transformation. Through their presence, their witness, their willingness to meet you in vulnerability, they activate the alchemical process by which your internal opposites, thinking and feeling, strength and receptivity, action and surrender, Begin to recognize each other, to dialogue, to discover their essential complementarity. Feel how different this is from the sexuality of seeking. Instead of reaching outside yourself for completion, you bring your wholeness to the encounter. Instead of needing the other to fill your emptiness, you offer your fullness as a gift. Instead of losing yourself in union, you find yourself more completely than ever before. This is the paradox of sacred sexuality. The more integrated you become within yourself, the more deeply you can unite with another. The masculine principle within you, whether you inhabit a male or female body, carries the energy of focused intention, of penetrating awareness, of the capacity to hold space and provide structure. When this masculine is conscious rather than defensive, it does not dominate but serves the greater wholeness. It provides the container within which transformation can safely occur. The feminine principle within you carries the energy of receptive, knowing, of the capacity to feel deeply and allow change, of the wisdom that emerges through surrender rather than force. When this feminine is conscious rather than passive, it does not submit, but actively participates in its own transformation. It provides the creative matrix within which new life can emerge. In ordinary sexuality, these principles often remain unconscious and therefore project themselves onto external partners. You may find yourself expecting your lover to embody either the masculine or feminine qualities you have not yet integrated within yourself. The man seeks the receptive feminine in his partner while remaining cut off from his own capacity for vulnerability. The woman seeks the strong masculine in her partner while denying her own inner strength. But in the sexuality of inner union, these projections are gradually withdrawn. You begin to recognize that every quality you seek in another already exists within you in potential form. The strength you admire in your partner becomes a call to develop your own inner masculine. The tenderness you crave from them becomes an invitation to cultivate your own inner feminine. This does not eliminate the beauty of difference between partners. It transforms it. Instead of needing the other to be what you are not, you can appreciate their unique expression of qualities you are also developing within yourself. Instead of complementarity based on mutual incompleteness, you discover complementarity based on mutual wholeness, expressing itself in diverse ways. The sacred marriage within requires what the alchemists called the solve et coagula, the dissolving. And reforming that allows rigid patterns to become fluid and then crystallize into new configurations. In your sexuality, this means allowing the fixed roles and expectations you have carried to dissolve, creating space for more authentic and spontaneous expressions of your essential nature. This dissolution can be frightening at first. If you have always been the strong one, learning to receive care and protection can feel like losing your identity. If you have always been the receptive one, claiming your power and taking initiative can feel foreign and dangerous. The ego resists these changes because they threaten its familiar sense of self. But what dies in this process is not your true nature. It is the limitation of your true nature. The masculine that emerges through conscious integration is not the rigid patriarchal masculine of dominance and control, but the sacred masculine of conscious strength, protective love, and purposeful action. The feminine that emerges is not the diminished feminine of submission and self-sacrifice, but the sacred feminine of creative power, intuitive wisdom, and transformative receptivity. In the physical act of lovemaking, this inner integration manifests as a dance of energy rather than a performance of roles. Sometimes you lead, sometimes you follow. Sometimes you give, sometimes you receive. Sometimes you penetrate, sometimes you are penetrated, not just physically, but emotionally, energetically, spiritually. The encounter becomes a fluid exchange of qualities that serves the expansion of both partners' wholeness. This sexuality is inherently creative, not necessarily in the biological sense of creating children, though it may include that, but in the alchemical sense of creating new possibilities, new ways of being, new expressions of consciousness. Each conscious sexual encounter becomes a laboratory for the ongoing work of individuation, a place where the personality can experiment with new ways of expressing its full range of human potentials. The sacred marriage is also a death and rebirth process. In the moment of deepest union, whether with another or with the opposing forces within yourself, the separate ego temporarily dies. You touch the place beyond individual identity, where all separation dissolves into undifferentiated oneness. But unlike the ego death of unconscious sexuality, this dissolution is conscious and therefore transformative rather than merely overwhelming. From this temporary death, you are reborn, more whole than before. You return to individual consciousness, having touched the source from which all individuality emerges. You have died to your limited sense of self and been reborn as a more complete expression of your essential nature. This is why the French call orgasm la petite mort. It offers practice for the greater death and rebirth that consciousness undergoes in its journey toward wholeness. The path to this inner union requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Instead of splitting your experience into good and bad, spiritual and physical, masculine and feminine, you learn to hold paradox. You discover that you can be both strong and vulnerable, both independent and interdependent, both individual and connected. This capacity to embrace paradox is perhaps the most essential skill for conscious sexuality. In practical terms, this means bringing awareness to every aspect of your sexual experience. You notice when you are performing rather than being authentic. You observe when you are seeking validation rather than offering genuine intimacy. You recognize when you are trying to escape from something rather than moving toward connection. You become curious about your patterns without being judgmental about them. This consciousness transforms not just what you do, but how you do it. The same physical actions that once served unconscious needs begin to serve conscious purposes. Touch becomes not just pleasurable, but communicative, not just exciting, but healing, not just satisfying, but transformative. The body becomes a temple where the sacred marriage is continuously celebrated. The integration of opposites within yourself also transforms your relationship to desire itself. Instead of being driven by unconscious hunger, you begin to desire from fullness rather than emptiness. Your wanting becomes an expression of life force rather than a symptom of deprivation. You desire not because you lack something, but because you have something beautiful to share. This shift from seeking to offering is perhaps the most radical transformation possible in human sexuality. It moves you from the consumer consciousness that dominates our culture, where others exist to satisfy your needs, to a creative consciousness where your needs exist to generate gifts for others. Your desire becomes a form of generosity rather than a form of taking. The sacred marriage is never complete in any final sense. It is an ongoing process, a continuous dance of integration that deepens throughout your lifetime. Each relationship, each sexual encounter, each moment of conscious intimacy offers new opportunities to practice this inner alchemy. You never master it completely. You simply become more skillful at participating in the eternal dance of opposites within your own being. This is the sexuality of the individuated person, not someone who has transcended sexuality, but someone who has integrated it into their larger journey of becoming whole. They bring to their intimate relationships not desperate need, but conscious choice, not projection, but clear seeing, not compulsion, but creative spontaneity. They have discovered that the union they once sought outside themselves was always available within, and this discovery transforms every external relationship into an opportunity for deeper self-discovery. In the sacred chamber of this inner marriage, you discover that you are both the lover and the beloved, the seeker and the sought, the question and the answer to your own deepest longing. You realize that every external relationship has been preparation for this internal recognition. Every heartbreak has been initiation into this deeper love. Every moment of sexual awakening has been a step toward this ultimate homecoming to your own complete nature. The hieros gamos is not an achievement but a recognition. The recognition that what you have always been seeking has always been present within you, waiting only for your consciousness to become spacious enough to embrace it. In this recognition, sexuality becomes not an escape from yourself, but a return to yourself, not a loss of identity, but a discovery of your most essential identity, not a dissolution into unconsciousness, but an expansion into the full consciousness of who you have always been. There is a path that leads not through the body, but beyond it, not by denial of desire, but by its conscious transformation. This is the way of sublimation, the alchemical art of taking the raw fire of sexual energy and refining it into something more subtle, more powerful, more aligned with the soul's deepest purposes. It is the practice of celibacy understood not as repression, but as redirection, not as escape from the erotic, but as its most profound expression. The mystics knew this secret. Behind the walls of monasteries and ashrams, in the caves of hermits and the cells of contemplatives, they discovered that sexual energy, when neither indulged nor suppressed, but consciously transformed, becomes the very fuel for spiritual awakening. They learned to work with desire as an alchemist works with fire, not to extinguish it, but to channel its heat toward the great work of transformation. This is perhaps the most misunderstood path in our culture of sexual liberation. We have been taught that healthy sexuality requires expression, that celibacy is necessarily pathological, that abstinence is a form of violence against our natural impulses. But this understanding conflates repression with sublimation, suppression with transformation. True celibacy is not the killing of desire, but its conscious redirection toward union with the divine self. Feel the difference in your own body. When you repress sexual energy, you create internal conflict. The desire doesn't disappear. It goes underground, where it festers and distorts, emerging in neurotic symptoms, compulsive behaviors, or psychological rigidity. This is not celibacy, but its counterfeit, a fearful rejection of life force that diminishes rather than expands consciousness. But when you sublimate sexual energy, you work with it as a conscious collaborator in your own transformation. You neither deny its presence nor automatically act upon its impulses. Instead, you create a space where this powerful energy can be felt, honored, and gradually transformed into something that serves your highest development. The fire burns, but it burns upward rather than outward. The alchemists had a phrase for this process: the wedding of opposites. In sublimation, you marry the energies of desire and restraint, of passion and discipline, of the body's hunger and the spirit's aspiration. This internal marriage produces something neither pure indulgence nor pure abstinence could create alone. A third thing, a new form of consciousness that transcends the ordinary dualities of sexual experience. Jung understood that sexual energy is fundamentally creative energy, The same force that drives procreation also drives all forms of creativity, spiritual development, and psychological growth. When this energy is not channeled into sexual expression, it doesn't simply disappear. It seeks other outlets, other forms of creation. The celibate monk creating illuminated manuscripts, the abstinent artist painting masterpieces, the continent, mystic achieving states of divine union, all are examples of sexual energy finding alternative expressions. But sublimation is not automatic. It requires conscious intention, disciplined practice, and deep understanding of the energy you are working with. Simply abstaining from sexual activity while remaining unconscious of your desire creates not transformation, but frustration. The energy remains crude, unrefined, creating internal pressure that eventually demands release in some form. The path of conscious sublimation begins with acknowledgement. You must first recognize and accept the presence of sexual energy within you. This is not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be transformed. You learn to feel desire without immediately acting upon it, to experience arousal without automatically seeking release, to be present with the energy itself rather than only with its potential objects. This requires developing what the mystics called the witness, a part of consciousness that can observe the arising and passing of desire without being overwhelmed by it. You learn to watch thoughts of attraction without becoming identified with them, to feel the stirring of sexual energy without becoming compulsive about satisfying it. This witnessing creates space between you and your impulses, space where choice becomes possible. In this space, transformation begins. The raw energy of sexual desire starts to refine itself, like base metals transmuting into gold in the alchemical furnace. What was once purely biological becomes psychological. What was personal becomes transpersonal. What was directed toward another becomes directed toward the self. The same energy that once sought union with a human beloved now seeks union with the divine beloved within. This is not a denial of the body, but its spiritualization. The celibate practitioner learns to experience the body as a temple, a sacred vessel for consciousness, rather than merely a vehicle for pleasure. Physical sensations become gateways to subtle energies. Arousal becomes a form of prayer, and the very tension of unfulfilled desire becomes a kind of spiritual practice. The traditions that developed conscious celibacy understood that this path requires structure, community, and deep philosophical understanding. The monastery provides not just isolation from sexual opportunity, but a complete framework for channeling erotic energy into spiritual development. Daily practices of meditation, prayer, service, and study create alternative pathways for the life force to flow. But sublimation is not only for monks and nuns. In our ordinary lives, we encounter many situations where conscious abstinence serves transformation. The person healing from sexual trauma may need periods of celibacy to reclaim their body as their own. The individual recovering from sexual addiction may need abstinence to break compulsive patterns. The artist or writer may choose temporary celibacy to channel creative energy into their work. Even within committed relationships, conscious periods of abstinence can serve the deeper union of the couple. By temporarily withdrawing from sexual expression, partners can explore other forms of intimacy, can discover whether their bond is based on genuine connection or merely on sexual chemistry. The energy that would have been expressed sexually gets channeled into emotional intimacy, shared spiritual practice, or creative collaboration. The key is that this abstinence is chosen consciously, not imposed by fear or neurosis. It is undertaken with clear intention and understanding of its purpose. It is practiced with awareness of the energy being redirected rather than simply suppressed. And it is temporary, a tool for transformation rather than a permanent rejection of sexuality. Jung observed that the capacity for sublimation is actually a sign of psychological health rather than pathology. It indicates that the individual has developed enough ego strength to defer immediate gratification in service of longer-term goals. It suggests a relationship with desire that is mature enough to include choice, discipline, and conscious intention. This capacity becomes especially important in our hypersexualized culture, where we are constantly bombarded with sexual stimuli and encouraged to see immediate satisfaction as the only healthy response to desire. The ability to feel attraction without acting upon it, to experience arousal without seeking immediate relief, to be present with desire without being driven by it, these become forms of spiritual practice in a world that has forgotten the transformative power of conscious restraint. But sublimation also requires wisdom about its own limitations. Extended periods of celibacy can become just as unconscious as compulsive sexual behavior if they are not practiced with awareness. The energy can become stagnant rather than transformed, creating rigidity, emotional coldness, or spiritual bypassing of important psychological work. The mystics spoke of dry periods in spiritual practice, times when the energy seems to disappear entirely, when desire fades and the practitioner feels neither sexual nor spiritual aliveness. These periods are part of the natural rhythm of sublimation, moments when the energy is working at such deep levels that it becomes temporarily unavailable to ordinary consciousness. They require patience and trust in the process. The fruit of conscious sublimation is not the elimination of sexuality, but its transformation into a more refined expression. The celibate practitioner may eventually discover that their entire being has become erotic, not in the sense of being sexually aroused, but in the sense of being fully alive, fully present, fully responsive to the beauty and mystery of existence. They have learned to make love with life itself. This is why the great mystics often speak in the language of lovers. Their poetry is filled with images of union, surrender, penetration, and ecstasy. They have discovered that the deepest spiritual experiences use the same psychological and energetic pathways as sexual experience. Their celibacy has not killed their capacity for erotic experience, but has universalized it, extending it beyond the personal to embrace the cosmic. The path of sublimation is not for everyone, nor is it meant to be. It is one option among many for working consciously with sexual energy, but understanding its principles can inform anyone's relationship with desire. Whether you choose celibacy or active sexuality, whether you practice abstinence or indulgence, the key is consciousness, the awareness of what you are doing and why, the intention behind your choices, the understanding of the energy you are working with. In our time, when sexual expression is often confused with sexual liberation, the path of conscious sublimation offers a counterbalance. It reminds us that true freedom includes the freedom to choose restraint, that authentic self-expression sometimes requires not expressing everything we feel, that the highest forms of creativity often emerge from the conscious transformation of desire rather than its immediate satisfaction. The fire burns within you, whether you feed it or redirect it. The question is not whether to have sexual energy. You cannot be alive without it. The question is how to work with this energy consciously, how to let it serve your deepest purposes, how to transform it into whatever form of creation or connection or transcendence your soul most deeply desires. Sublimation is the art of making this choice consciously, of becoming an alchemist of your own desire, of learning to work with the raw material of sexual energy as a sculptor works with stone, not to destroy it, but to reveal the masterpiece that was always hidden within it. Whether that masterpiece is a human relationship, a work of art, a spiritual realization, or something entirely unique to your own journey, the energy remains the same. Only the form of its expression changes. This is the wisdom the mystics discovered, in their cells and caves, that the same energy that drives us toward another can drive us toward the self, that the same fire that burns in sexual passion can burn in spiritual devotion, that the same force that creates children can create new forms of consciousness. The path of sublimation is simply the recognition that this energy belongs to you, that you can choose how to direct it, and that sometimes the most profound expression of erotic energy is its conscious transformation into something beyond the purely personal. In this transformation, you discover that celibacy is not the opposite of sexuality, but its most refined expression. Not the denial of desire, but its ultimate fulfillment through union with the source from which all desire springs. The Tao. Screens flicker with synthetic light, casting shadows that dance across faces hungry for something they cannot name. In the blue glow of endless feeds, desire has been captured, packaged, and sold back to us as commodity. A hollow reflection of what once pulsed with sacred fire in the depths of human longing. We have entered an age where the erotic self, that most intimate expression of our life force, has been colonized by forces that understand nothing of its true nature. Like merchants in the temple, they have set up their stalls in the sanctuary of human desire, trading in counterfeit passion while the authentic flame grows dim beneath layers of manufactured want. The word erotic itself has been stripped of its deeper meaning, reduced to mere sexuality when it once encompassed the full spectrum of creative, life-affirming energy. Eros, the ancient Greeks understood, was the force that drives all creation, the magnetic pull that draws soul to soul, the creative tension that births art, love, and meaning itself. But in our modern landscape, this sacred energy has been harvested, refined, and redistributed as pornography, as advertising, as the endless hunger that feeds the machine of consumption. Watch how desire moves through the collective unconscious now, no longer arising from the depths of personal longing, but manufactured in boardrooms and focus groups. The patriarchal structure, that ancient system of control and dominance, has found in digital technology its most powerful tool yet for the colonization of human intimacy. It whispers to us through algorithms that know our weaknesses better than we know our strengths, offering us shadows of satisfaction while keeping us forever hungry for more. The pornographic mind, and here we speak not merely of explicit content, but of a way of seeing that reduces the sacred to the consumable, has infected our relationship with our own bodies, our own desires, our own capacity for genuine connection. In this realm, the other becomes object, the body becomes commodity, and the soul becomes consumer. The infinite complexity of human longing is flattened into simple transactions of power and pleasure, leaving the deeper hungers of the heart to starve in silence. Consider how the young soul, awakening to its own erotic nature, encounters not the wisdom of elders who have learned to honor this force, but the cold mechanics of a system that profits from their confusion. The natural curiosity about sexuality, about intimacy, about the mysterious pull between souls, is met with images that teach domination rather than connection, performance rather than presence, consumption rather than communion. The shadow of this colonization runs deeper than we might imagine. In Jung's understanding, the shadow contains not only what we have rejected about ourselves, but what has been rejected for us by the culture we inherit. The erotic shadow of our time carries the weight of centuries of suppression, distortion, and commodification. It holds the rage of bodies that have been objectified, the grief of souls that have been reduced to their sexual function, the despair of hearts that have been taught to mistake conquest for connection. But beneath this shadow, the authentic erotic self continues to pulse with its ancient wisdom. It knows the difference between the manufactured desire that empties us and the sacred longing that fills us. It remembers that true intimacy requires not the conquest of the other, but the surrender of the false self, the persona we wear to navigate the world of appearances. The patriarchal structure that has colonized our desire operates through a fundamental misunderstanding of power. It believes that to be powerful, one must dominate, that to be safe, one must control, that to be loved, one must possess. But the erotic self knows a different kind of power, the power that emerges from vulnerability, from the courage to be seen in our full humanity, from the willingness to let another's presence transform us. This is why the commodification of desire is so particularly devastating. It takes what is meant to be a sacred exchange, the meeting of souls through the gateway of the body, and transforms it into a transaction. The other becomes a product to be consumed, a service to be purchased, a fantasy to be indulged. The reciprocal dance of authentic intimacy is replaced by the one-way flow of consumption. The symptoms of this colonization are everywhere. We see it in the epidemic of loneliness that plagues our hyper-connected world, in the rising rates of sexual dysfunction among young people who have learned their desires from screens rather than from their own bodies, in the way genuine intimacy has become almost countercultural in its rarity. The soul's deep need for connection is met with the shallow satisfaction of digital interaction, leaving us perpetually hungry for something we can no longer name. But perhaps most tragically, we see it in the way we have learned to relate to our own bodies, our own desires, our own capacity for pleasure. The erotic self, colonized by external forces, begins to judge itself by the standards of its colonizers. We learn to see our bodies through the lens of the pornographic gaze, to measure our desires against manufactured norms, to shame ourselves for wanting what the culture tells us we should want, while simultaneously feeling empty when we get it. The healing of the erotic self requires nothing less than a revolution, not the external revolution of political movements, though that may be part of it, but the internal revolution of reclaiming our own capacity for authentic desire. It requires learning to distinguish between the hunger that arises from our depths and the hunger that has been programmed into us by forces that profit from our emptiness. This is the work of individuation in the realm of the erotic. Learning to honor our authentic desires while refusing to be enslaved by manufactured ones. It requires developing what we might call erotic consciousness, the ability to recognize when we are being sold a counterfeit version of our own longing, when the sacred is being reduced to the sellable, when connection is being replaced by consumption. The path forward is not the path of suppression, that old patriarchal solution that created many of our current problems. Nor is it the path of indulgence, which leads only to the sophisticated slavery of addiction. It is the path of discernment, of learning to honor the erotic self, while refusing to let it be colonized by forces that understand nothing of its true nature. This requires tremendous courage, for it means standing against the tide of cultural conditioning that surrounds us. It means choosing presence over performance, authenticity over fantasy, connection over consumption. It means learning to see our own bodies and the bodies of others as sacred rather than as objects to be used or possessed. But perhaps most importantly, it requires recognizing that the healing of our erotic wounds is not a private matter, but a collective one. The forces that have colonized our desire are not individual, but systemic, not personal, but political. The liberation of the erotic self is therefore both an intimate and a social act, both a personal and a cultural transformation. The sacred fire of authentic desire still burns beneath the ashes of our conditioning. It waits for us to remember its true nature, to honor its deeper purposes, to allow it to burn away what is false so that what is true can emerge. In reclaiming our erotic sovereignty, we reclaim not only our capacity for genuine intimacy, but our power to create a world where the sacred is honored rather than sold, where bodies are temples rather than commodities, where desire serves love rather than profit. This is the invitation that stands before us, to become conscious of how our most intimate energies have been colonized and to begin the sacred work of liberation. For in freeing our erotic self from the forces that would exploit it, we free ourselves to discover what authentic desire really is. Not the manufactured hunger that can never be satisfied, but the sacred longing that connects us to the deepest sources of life itself. In the deepest chambers of the soul, where shadow meets light and flesh communes with spirit, there exists a sovereignty that cannot be granted by external authority, cannot be purchased with worldly currency, and cannot be stolen by those who would colonize our most intimate longings. This is the sovereignty of Eros, the sacred dominion over our own desire, the conscious mastery of our creative and sexual energies, the integration of our animal nature with our divine aspirations. To arrive at this sovereignty is to complete a journey that began in the unconscious depths of instinct and fantasy, traveled through the wasteland of shame and suppression, and now emerges into the luminous realm where consciousness and desire dance together in perfect, paradoxical harmony. This is not the sovereignty of the ego, which seeks to control and possess, but the sovereignty of the self, that deeper center of being that knows how to honor what is sacred in our sexuality while transforming what is wounded. The path to erotic sovereignty is the path of individuation itself, played out in the most intimate theater of human experience. Here, in the realm where bodies meet and souls recognize each other, we discover whether we have learned to distinguish between authentic desire and manufactured hunger, between sacred longing and compulsive need, between the love that liberates and the attachment that enslaves. This sovereignty does not emerge from the rejection of our sexual nature, that old path of asceticism that splits the soul in two, nor from its unconscious indulgence, which leads only to the sophisticated slavery of addiction. It emerges from what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension until something new is born. In the realm of sexuality, this means learning to honor both the animal and the divine within us, both the flesh that hungers and the spirit that aspires, both the personal desires that arise from our individual nature and the transpersonal longings that connect us to the cosmic dance of creation itself. The sovereign erotic self no longer moves through the world driven by unconscious compulsions or paralyzed by inherited shame. It has learned to distinguish between the voice of authentic desire, which arises from the depths of our being and calls us toward wholeness, and the voice of the colonized desire that has been programmed into us by forces that profit from our emptiness. This discrimination, this capacity for discernment in the realm of the erotic, is perhaps the most sophisticated form of consciousness we can develop. Consider the profound transformation that occurs when we move from being the unconscious slave of our sexual impulses to becoming their conscious sovereign. No longer does desire move through us like a foreign force, compelling us toward experiences that leave us emptier than before. Instead, we learn to dialogue with our desires, to understand their deeper meanings, to honor their sacred purposes, while refusing to be enslaved by their more superficial demands. This sovereignty manifests first in our relationship with our own body. The body that was once experienced as enemy or stranger, source of shame or uncontrollable impulse, becomes recognized as temple and teacher. We learn to inhabit our flesh with consciousness, to feel its hungers without being consumed by them, to honor its wisdom while maintaining our capacity for choice. The body becomes not the prison of the soul, but its most intimate collaborator in the dance of incarnation. But true erotic sovereignty extends far beyond the personal. It includes the recognition that our sexuality is not merely a private matter, but a sacred responsibility. How we relate to our own desires affects the collective consciousness of sexuality. How we treat our own bodies influences the cultural understanding of embodiment. How we practice intimacy contributes to the healing or wounding of the very fabric of human connection. The sovereign erotic self understands that every sexual encounter is a sacred ritual, whether conscious or unconscious. It knows that in the meeting of bodies, souls are touching, that in the exchange of pleasure, energies are being transferred, that in the moment of sexual connection, we are participating in the fundamental creative force of the universe. This knowledge brings not burden, but liberation, the freedom that comes from understanding the true significance of our most intimate experiences. This sovereignty requires the integration of what Jung called the contrasexual element within us. The masculine soul learns to honor the feminine wisdom of receptivity, intuition, and emotional depth. The feminine soul learns to honor the masculine wisdom of direction, focus, and conscious intention. In the realm of sexuality, this means that regardless of our biological sex or sexual orientation, we learn to embody both the active and receptive principles, both the penetrating and the receiving aspects of erotic energy. The path to this integration is rarely smooth. It requires facing what Jung called the shadow of our sexuality, all the aspects of our erotic nature that we have rejected, suppressed, or been taught to fear. This shadow may contain our capacity for aggression and dominance, our hunger for surrender and submission, our longing for the forbidden, our fear of our own power, our shame about our bodies, our rage at having been objectified, or our guilt at having objectified others. But as we learn to dialogue with these shadow elements rather than being possessed by them or rigidly defending against them, something remarkable occurs. The energy that was bound up in repression or compulsion becomes available for conscious choice. The desires that once seemed alien or dangerous are revealed as distorted expressions of legitimate needs. The sexuality that was once either suppressed or indulged becomes an instrument of consciousness, a pathway to deeper intimacy with ourselves and others. This is the great paradox of erotic sovereignty. It is achieved not through the control of desire, but through its conscious acceptance and integration. The sovereign erotic self does not eliminate sexual hunger, but learns to nourish it with experiences that truly satisfy. It does not suppress the body's wisdom, but learns to translate its language into conscious understanding. It does not reject the shadow, but learns to dance with it without being consumed by it. In this dance, we discover that our sexuality is not separate from our spirituality, but its most intimate expression. The same energy that draws us toward sexual union is the energy that drives our longing for divine connection. The same force that creates physical pleasure is the force that generates creative inspiration. The same power that enables us to surrender to another in intimacy is the power that allows us to surrender to the greater mystery of existence itself. The sovereign erotic self recognizes that in the moment of sexual connection, we are not merely satisfying biological urges, but participating in the cosmic dance of creation and destruction, union and separation, death and rebirth. Every orgasm is a small death, every sexual encounter a rehearsal for the ultimate surrender. Every moment of intimacy is a glimpse into the fundamental nature of existence, the eternal play of consciousness with itself, the endless dance of the one and the many. This recognition transforms not only our sexual experiences, but our entire approach to life. The consciousness that learns to honor the sacred in sexuality begins to see the sacred everywhere. The sovereignty that is achieved in the realm of desire extends to all other realms of experience. The integration that occurs in the body spreads to the integration of all aspects of the self. But perhaps most importantly, the sovereign erotic self becomes a gift to the world. No longer driven by unconscious compulsions or paralyzed by inherited shame, it becomes capable of genuine intimacy, authentic connection and conscious love. It models for others what it means to honor the sacred in the sexual, to find the divine in the human, to discover transcendence through embodiment rather than despite it. This is the ultimate fruit of the journey through the shadow of sexuality. Not the elimination of desire, but its transformation. Not the suppression of the body, but its sanctification. Not the rejection of the erotic, but its elevation to its rightful place as one of the most profound expressions of human consciousness. In claiming our sovereignty over our own desires, we claim our place as conscious participants in the cosmic dance of creation itself. The path ends where it began, in the recognition that we are beings capable of both animal passion and divine love, both earthly pleasure and spiritual transcendence. But now we know that these are not opposites to be reconciled, but aspects of a single reality to be celebrated. In the sovereignty of Eros, the self emerges radiant and whole, no longer divided against itself, but integrated in the magnificent complexity of human consciousness awakened to its own sacred nature. YouTube video description. In this deeply immersive exploration of Carl Jung's psychology, we confront the fire beneath our carefully constructed identities. The invisible flame of sexual instinct and desire. Sex controls you more than you think is not a sensational claim, but a psychological revelation. Our longing, our attractions, even our shame are not simply conscious choices, but expressions of the unconscious reaching for integration. Carl Jung understood that Eros is not merely a biological drive, it is a sacred current that shapes our lives, relationships, and sense of identity. This video journeys through the terrain of shadow, projection, and instinct, revealing how sexual desire mirrors our own psychological fragmentation and our yearning for wholeness. Beneath our personas and social roles lies a wild, ancient creature, one we must not repress, but invite into conscious dialogue. This is not about indulgence, it is about individuation. To know the unconscious source of our desire is to awaken to the mythic forces that move within us, archetypes of the Great Mother, the divine masculine, and the eternal dance of union and separation. Sexuality, in this frame, becomes initiation, a portal to psychological rebirth. If you've ever wondered why love, lust, or longing destabilize you, or why they feel so sacred, this video offers a powerful Jungian lens. What does your desire reveal about you? Share your reflections below. Your story may illuminate the path for others. Carl Jung, Dachi Jungian psychology, Chat shadow work, Dachi individuation, Chat depth, psychology, Chat archetypes, Eros and psyche, Chat animus and anima, the shadow self, Chat the unconscious mind.